In the latter half of the 18th century, the establishment of order began not with the sound of cannon fire, but with the scratching of a quill against coarse parchment. The world of administration was a silent one, defined by the accumulation of paper and the slow, methodical organization of distinct facts into columns of black ink. Within the dim interiors of brick counting houses and provisional government offices, the air remained still, disturbed only by the shuffling of feet or the turning of a heavy page. Here, the foundational work of a nascent state took the form of lists, inventories, and ledgers, bound in leather and stored on shelves of unpolished pine. The day for a clerk began before the sun had fully risen, often in a room heated by a single wood stove. The atmosphere was one of quiet repetition. The tools of the trade were arranged with precise geometry upon the desk. A ceramic inkwell, often chipped at the rim, a shaker of sand for drying the wet ink, a bundle of quills derived from goose feathers requiring constant sharpening, and a stack of paper, distinct in its rag content and texture. The paper itself was a logistical artifact, often imported or manufactured in local mills, where old linens were pulped and pressed into sheets that bore the subtle imperfections of the sieve. Each sheet represented a potential space for authority to be exerted, not through force, but through record-keeping. The act of writing was a physical labor. The clerk would select a quill, using a small penknife to shape the nib to a fine point, ensuring the slit was centered to allow the ink to flow evenly. This maintenance was performed multiple times within a single hour. The ink, usually an iron gall mixture, darkened as it dried, biting into the fibers of the paper to create a permanent mark. As the fluid oxidized, it turned from a purple-black to a deep, rusty brown, a color that would come to dominate the archives of the era. The smell of the room was a combination of iron, dust, burning wood, and the faint, acidic scent of curing paper. In the custom houses located in the port cities, Philadelphia, Boston, Charleston, New York, the routine was dictated by the tides and the arrival of merchant vessels. The administration of revenue was the primary engine of the state's survival, and it functioned through a strict hierarchy of documentation. When a ship docked, it was not merely a vessel of goods, it was a catalog of taxable items. The manifest, a long, narrow document, listed every crate, barrel, and bale stored within the hold. The weighing and measuring of these goods required a standardization of units that was often theoretical rather than actual. Men employed as weighers and gaugers utilized brass weights and wooden measuring rods, checking the volume of Madeira wine, the weight of molasses, or the yardage of imported textiles. These figures were transferred by hand into the great entry books. A clerk would dip the pen and inscribe the name of the vessel, the master's name, the port of origin, and the specific duties owed. There was no room for interpretation. The columns had to align perfectly. If a mistake was made, it was rarely crossed out. Rather, the page might be scraped with a knife to remove the top layer of paper, or the entire sheet might be recopied. The pursuit of a clean ledger was paramount. The ledger was the proxy for the treasury itself. In the absence of a central bank with vast vaults of gold, the credit of the government resided in the accuracy of these books. The silence of the custom house was the silence of calculation, where the chaotic commerce of the Atlantic was reduced to arithmetic. Beyond the ports, the administration of the interior required a different set of tools and a different conceptual framework. The land itself was the primary asset of the state, yet it existed largely as an abstraction until it could be measured, described, and recorded. The process of surveying was the administrative conquest of the wilderness. It was a slow, linear progression through forests and wetlands, undertaken by small teams of men carrying the gunter's chain. This chain, exactly 66 feet in length, was composed of 100 iron links. It was the physical instrument that imposed a grid upon the natural world. The survey team operated with a rhythmic slowness. The forward chainman would pull the chain taut, guided by the surveyor who viewed the line through a brass compass or a theodolite mounted on a tripod. The compass needle, floating in its casing, provided the bearing. Once the chain was level and straight, a pin was driven into the earth. The rear chainman would then move up to the pin, and the process would repeat. 80 chains made a mile. The work was tedious, involving the constant clearing of brush and the marking of witness trees near the corner of a plot that were blazed with an axe and inscribed with the section and township numbers. These marks on the trees were the only physical evidence of the administration in the deep woods. They turned a biological entity into a legal coordinate. The field notes taken by the surveyor were brief and utilitarian, noting the quality of the soil, the presence of timber, and the location of water sources. These notes were then carried back to district land offices, often weeks away by horse or flatboat. In the office, the raw data of chains and links was translated into plat maps. A draftsman, working by the light of a window or a candle, would draw the square townships in sections, dividing the blank paper into a perfect grid of 1-mile squares. This grid ignored topography. It was an administrative overlay that sought to make the land fungible, saleable, and governable. Back in the centers of administration, the preservation of these records became a concern of architecture and cabinetry. Documents were folded into thirds, labeled on the outside with a summary of their contents, and tied with red tape or ribbon. They were stored in pigeonholes, wooden compartments built into the walls of the clerks' offices. As time passed, the volume of paper grew, necessitating the construction of dedicated archive rooms. These spaces were designed to be dry and secure, though the threat of fire was a constant, low-level anxiety that permeated the administrative mind. The duplication of records was the only insurance. Clerks spent hours copying letters into letter books, creating a verbatim transcript of outgoing correspondence to ensure that a record existed should the original be lost in transit. The transit of information was the circulatory system of this administrative body. The post road was the artery. The movement of a letter from a department head to a customs collector was governed by the physics of the horse and the condition of the road. Mail bags, made of heavy canvas or leather, were sealed with wax and locked. The post rider or the stagecoach driver was a functionary in a vast, decentralized machine. The arrival of the post was a regulating event. It dictated the pace of work. A query sent regarding a tax dispute might take weeks to receive a reply. This latency was built into the administrative process. Decisions were made in slow motion. A file might remain open for months, sitting on a desk, waiting for a single piece of paper to arrive from a distant outpost to complete the chain of evidence. The internal economy of the office relied on a strict hierarchy of labor. The chief clerk managed the flow of work, assigning copying duties to junior clerks. There was a discipline to the handwriting. The scripts used, often a variation of round hand or copperplate, were designed for legibility and speed. Personal flourishes were discouraged. The ideal administrative hand was uniform, anonymous, and clear. A ledger kept in Boston should be legible to a Treasury official in Philadelphia. This standardization was a form of technology. allowing information to be decoupled from the individual who wrote it and treated as objective data. In the evenings, after the shutters were closed and the candles extinguished, the offices held a heavy silence. The smell of ink and old paper lingered. The ledgers sat on the shelves, their spines facing outward, holding the suspended financial reality of the state. The administration was a creature of daylight and candlelight, dormant in the dark. The security of the building was often left to a single watchman, whose footsteps on the floorboards marked the passage of the night hours. The physical security of the documents was fragile. A leaking roof, a gnawing mouse, or a spilled candle could destroy years of labor. Yet, the system relied on the accumulation of these fragile sheets. The procurement of supplies for these offices was a logistical task in itself. Requisitions were filed for sealing wax, for sand, for twine, and for firewood. The government had to purchase the means of its own administration. Contracts were issued for the printing of blank forms. The rise of the pre-printed form was a significant evolution in administrative efficiency. Instead of writing out the entire text of a bond or a license, a clerk could simply fill in the blank spaces on a printed sheet. This reduced the time required for each transaction and ensured uniformity in the legal language. The printing press thus became an extension of the administrative desk, churning out thousands of identical permits, warrants, and declarations. In the Treasury, the focus was on the management of debt and the handling of certificates. The war had left a legacy of paper currency and promissory notes, a chaotic swirl of valuations that required sorting. Clerks spent their days examining these worn, dirty scraps of paper, verifying their authenticity against registration books. The detection of counterfeits was a learned skill, involving the scrutiny of signatures, the texture of the paper, and the quality of the engraving. Invalid notes were perforated or stamped. Valid ones were recorded and consolidated. This process of funding the debt was slow, tedious, and mathematical. It required the patience to sift through thousands of individual claims to build a coherent picture of national obligation. The routine extended to the maintenance of the buildings themselves. The sweeping of floors, the cleaning of the hearth, the washing of windows. These were the unseen tasks that allowed the clerical work to proceed. Dust was the enemy of the archive. It settled on the bundles of letters and obscured the labels. Periodic cleanings were mandated, where files were taken down, dusted, and retied. The preservation of the state's memory required a constant battle against physical decay. As the years in the late 18th century progressed, the volume of administrative matter increased. The single room grew into a suite of rooms. The single ledger grew into a library of accounts. The sound of the quill was joined by the sounds of more voices, more footsteps, and the constant arrival of messengers. Yet the core of the work remained unchanged. The translation of the world into ink, the filing of that ink into systems of retrieval, and the quiet, persistent belief that order could be maintained through the rigorous application of procedure. The foundation was not built on stone, but on the accumulated weight of paper stacked sheet by sheet, year after year, in the quiet corners of the rising republic. By the turn of the 19th century, the scope of administration had expanded beyond the static ledgers of the counting houses to encompass the physical enumeration of the population itself. The state required a precise understanding of its human geography, a task that necessitated a logistical operation of unprecedented scale. This process, mandated to occur every 10 years, mobilized a network of assistant marshals who functioned as the sensory nerves of the central government. They were dispatched not into the predictable environment of a port city, but into the sprawling, unmapped hinterlands where roads were often little more than widened game trails, and the authority of the state was a distant abstraction. The tools of the enumerator were portable and resilient. Unlike the stationary clerk with his heavy desk, the marshal carried his office in a saddlebag. The census schedules were large sheets of paper, ruled by hand or printed with vertical columns that demanded specific data. The name of the head of the family, the number of free white males aged 16 and upward, free white males under 16, free white females, other free persons, and slaves. There was no room for narrative. The life of a household was compressed into a single horizontal line of integers. To capture this data, the marshal had to physically visit every dwelling, a requirement that transformed the administrative process into a test of endurance. Travel in the rural districts was dictated by the season and the weather. In the spring, the roads were often impassable mires of clay and mud. In the summer, the heat and dust posed different challenges. The marshal would arrive at an isolated homestead, often announcing his presence to wary inhabitants who viewed the collection of information with suspicion. The interaction was formal and brief. The marshal would produce the schedule, unfurl it upon a rough table or a fence post, and dip his pen into a traveling inkwell, a small, stoppered vial often secured to a buttonhole or a belt to prevent spillage. The answers were recorded in the script of the day, sometimes hurried and jagged from the fatigue of the ride, yet legally binding. Once a district was completed, the sheets were not immediately sent to the capital. They were first posted in two public places within the district, often a tavern, a meeting house, or a courthouse door, for inspection. This public verification was a systemic check against error, allowing neighbors to correct the tally of their community. Following this interval, the schedules were aggregated. The mathematics of the nation were performed locally before being transmitted centrally. The assistant marshals tallied their columns, submitting a summary return to the marshal of the judicial district. These aggregate numbers, stripped of individual names, were the raw material that would eventually reach the Department of State. The final product was a set of statistical tables, a numeric portrait of the nation that allowed the government to apportion representation and assess its military and economic potential. While the census mapped the populace, another branch of administration sought to catalog the mechanical ingenuity of the era. The Patent Office existed as a distinct repository, not of financial debts, but of intellectual property. The system established here was rigorous. An inventor seeking protection for a new plow, a water wheel, or a milling machine was required to submit not only a written description and a drawing, but also a physical model. These models were miniature representations of the invention, functional and precise, constrained by law to be no larger than 12 inches square. The arrival of these models created a unique logistical challenge. They came by wagon and coach, crated in wood and packed with straw. Upon receipt, they were inspected by a superintendent who acted as the gatekeeper of innovation. The examination was a process of comparison. The administrator had to determine if the mechanism was truly novel or merely a modification of an existing device. This required a deep institutional memory and an organized system of storage. The models were categorized by function: agriculture, textiles, navigation, steam power, and placed in glass-fronted cabinets. The Patent Office thus became a museum of potential, a silent room filled with small wooden and brass machines that represented the industrialized future in miniature. The labeling of these models was a precise art. Small tags made of parchment or vellum were tied to the devices with twine, bearing the name of the inventor, the date of the patent, and a serial number. The correspondence associated with each patent was filed separately, creating a dual archive, one of three-dimensional objects and one of paper descriptions. The smell of this department was distinct, a mixture of sawdust, oil, varnished wood, and the ubiquitous dust of documents. The quiet here was broken by the occasional whir of a gear being tested, or the scratching of a draftsman's pen, as he copied a technical drawing for the official record. The physical center of this administrative world was undergoing a profound transition during this period. The movement of the government from Philadelphia to the new federal city on the Potomac was a massive logistical undertaking. It involved the packing of the entire state apparatus into wagons. The archives, the ledgers, the furniture, and the personnel were transported over roads that were notoriously poor. The arrival in the new capital was not a grand entry, but a struggle against the elements. The city was a construction site, a grid of muddy avenues cut through forests and scrubland, dotted with stumps and half-finished brick structures. For the clerks and officials, the new environment necessitated a change in daily routine. Housing was scarce. Most functionaries lived in boarding houses, congregating in shared messes where rank and hierarchy were temporarily suspended over the evening meal. The walk to the offices, the Treasury, the State Department, the War Department, often involved navigating planks laid over mud puddles or traversing fields where cattle still grazed. The government buildings themselves were islands of order in a chaotic landscape. They were built of sandstone and brick, designed to be fireproof, with high ceilings to mitigate the humid summer heat. Inside these new offices, the work continued with an intensified sense of isolation. The distractions of a major metropolis were absent. The clerk's world was defined by the four walls of his office and the view of the unfinished mall or the river. The silence was deeper here. The sounds of the city were replaced by the sounds of nature and construction, the sawing of stone, the hammering of carpenters, and the wind moving through the trees. In this solitude, the administrative procedures solidified. The departments, separated by significant physical distances within the city, developed their own internal cultures and filing systems. Communication between the Treasury and the State Department, though they were part of the same executive, required a messenger to walk or ride between the buildings, carrying leather portfolios protected from the rain. The preservation of documents in this damp, river-bound climate became a primary concern. Mold and mildew were constant threats to the paper archives. Clerks were tasked with airing out the ledgers and ensuring that the fireplaces were kept burning during the wet months to regulate the humidity. The use of sand to dry ink remained standard, but the quality of the sand and the ink itself was often variable, depending on the supplies that could be carted in from Baltimore or Alexandria. The supply chain for the administration was tenuous. A delay in a shipment of stationery could slow the work of a department for days. The system of filing began to evolve into a more complex taxonomy. Papers were no longer just bundled by date. They were increasingly indexed by subject. The pigeonhole system remained the standard for active files, but for older records, distinct presses, large wooden cupboards with shelving, were constructed. The organization of these presses was the responsibility of the chief clerks, who maintained mental maps of where specific treaties, contracts, or correspondence were located. The retrieval of a document was a manual process of sorting through bundles, untying ribbons, and reading endorsements on the folded jackets of the letters. Standardization extended to the very language of administration. Forms became more rigid. The circular letter became a standard tool for department heads to issue instructions to a dispersed network of collectors, postmasters, and marshals. These circulars were printed in batches and mailed out, creating a uniform set of operating procedures across the continent. A customs collector in Savannah and one in Portsmouth would receive the exact same printed instructions regarding the implementation of a new tariff act. This synchronization of procedure was the invisible glue holding the federal structure together. The workday in the new capital was regulated by the ringing of bells. With few personal timepieces, the clerks relied on the public clocks or the bells of the local churches and department buildings to mark the start of business, the midday break, and the cessation of labor. The hours were long, typically from 9 in the morning until 3 or 4 in the afternoon, often 6 days a week. The lighting in the winter months was provided by tallow candles or whale oil lamps, which cast a yellow, flickering light over the workspaces. The cost of candles was a line item in the contingent expenses of every department, meticulously tracked and audited. In the evenings, the boarding houses became extensions of the office. Men discussed the backlog of warrants, the interpretation of a statute, or the arrival of the latest packet boat. The social circle was small and insular. The separation between the official life and the private life was thin. The administration was not just a job, it was a total existence, bounded by the geography of the unfinished city and the endless flow of paper. The muddy boots left by the door, the ink-stained fingers, and the smell of tobacco smoke in the parlor were the textures of this bureaucratic life. The accumulation of administrative precedent was slow. Decisions made by a controller regarding a specific claim became the rule for future claims. These decisions were recorded in letter books, separate from the financial ledgers. A clerk wishing to know how to handle a specific type of irregular invoice would have to consult the index of the letter book to find a previous ruling. This reliance on internal case law created a system that was self-reinforcing and resistant to rapid change. The way things were done was locked in the bound volumes of correspondence, creating a continuity that survived the turnover of political appointees. As the years drifted on, the sheer mass of paper began to dictate the architecture. Basements and attics were colonized by the archives. The physical weight of the government was measured in tons of rag paper. Strongboxes of iron were procured for the most sensitive documents, treaties with foreign powers, the original laws, and the dies for the seals. The Great Seal itself was a piece of machinery, a heavy press operated by a screw, used to impress the wax wafers attached to official commissions. The operation of this seal was a ceremonial act of validation, the final step in a long process of drafting, copying, and verifying. The quiet persistence of this system lay in its redundancy and its modularity. If a clerk fell ill, another could take his place, guiding his pen by the same ruled lines and the same printed headings. If a building was threatened by fire, the first priority was the evacuation of the books. The abstraction of the state had become more real than the physical structures that housed it. The reality of the nation was anchored in the schedules of the census, the specifications of the patents, and the columns of the accounts, all resting in the quiet, dust-mote-filled air of the federal offices. As the 19th century advanced into its second and third decades, the administrative grid extended its reach further into the interior, carried not by the swiftness of events, but by the slow, relentless friction of wheels upon dirt roads. The infrastructure of the state began to solidify into a vast, interconnected mechanism of transit and delivery, bound together by the postal system. This network was the primary nervous system of the Republic, a web of routes designated by statute and maintained through a rigorous system of contracting. The post road was less a highway of stone than a legal corridor through the wilderness, defined by the scheduled passage of the mail stage. The administration of this system resided in the General Post Office, an institution that operated on a scale unmatched by any other department. Its operations were governed by the logic of the route, a specific path between 2 points with a designated frequency of travel. These routes were auctioned to private contractors, known as post riders or stage companies. The bidding process was a silent war of paper, where sealed proposals were submitted, opened, and recorded in great folio ledgers. The successful contractor was bound by a complex instrument, the mail contract, which stipulated the hours of departure and arrival, the mode of conveyance, and the penalties for failure. The star routes, those designated with asterisks in the official registers to indicate that the mail was to be carried with certainty, celerity, and security, formed the backbone of this logistical skeleton. Inside a contracting office, the walls were lined with maps, large sheets of paper glued to linen backing, rolled and stored in racks. These maps did not show topography so much as connectivity. They were diagrams of time and distance, marked with the locations of thousands of post offices, from the granite buildings of the eastern cities to the log cabin distribution points of the frontier. The work of the clerks here involved the constant updating of these routes, the auditing of the contractor's performance, and the processing of the waybills. The waybill was the manifest of the mail coach, a document that traveled with the bags, recording the number of packages, the time of arrival at each relay station, and the signature of the receiving postmaster. The physical handling of the mail was a ritual of sorting and bundling. In the larger distribution offices, the sorting room was a hive of compartmentalized order. One wall would be entirely occupied by a grid of wooden pigeonholes, each labeled with the name of a town or a distribution route. The sorting clerk stood before these cases, their movements rhythmic and repetitive. A letter was picked up, the address read, and the item slotted into the corresponding box. This action was performed thousands of times a day, a manual algorithm of routing. The sound of the room was the dry shuffle of paper and the thud of the canceling stamp. The stamp itself had evolved. Metal dies soaked in printer's ink were used to mark the letter with the name of the originating office and the date. The killer stamp, often a simple cork pattern or a grid of bars, was used to obliterate the postage rate or the stamp, preventing its reuse. For letters that could not be delivered, those addressed to individuals who had moved, died, or simply could not be found, there existed a specific administrative purgatory, the dead letter office. This department functioned as the final repository for the misdirected communications of the nation. Here, in a quiet room staffed by senior clerks, the sanctity of the seal was finally broken. The process was strictly regulated. The clerks opened the letters not to read the personal narratives, but to search for valuable enclosures, money, drafts, or legal documents. If items of value were found, they were recorded in a separate ledger, and an attempt was made to return them to the sender. If the letter contained nothing but text, it was consigned to the waste, eventually to be burned or pulped. The dead letter office was a place of silence and accumulation, where the failures of connection were catalogued and disposed of. Parallel to the movement of mail was the administration of the land itself. The General Land Office had matured into a sprawling bureaucracy dedicated to the transfer of the public domain into private hands. The mechanism for this transfer was the Land Office, a local administrative unit established in each district as soon as the survey was complete. These offices were often simple structures, yet they housed the critical archives of property. The staff consisted of two primary officials, the register and the receiver. Their functions were deliberately separated to create a system of internal checks and balances. The register was responsible for the tract book. This was a massive volume, pre-ruled with columns corresponding to the survey grid, section, township, and range. As land was sold, the register would enter the name of the purchaser and the date of sale against the specific coordinates of the plot. The receiver, conversely, handled the financial transaction. He accepted the payment, often in gold or silver specie or in verified land scrip, and issued a receipt. At the end of the month, the register's tract book and the receiver's journal had to reconcile perfectly. This dual-entry system was designed to prevent fraud in an environment far removed from central oversight. The culmination of this process was the issuance of the land patent. This was the definitive title, a document of high formality. In the early years, the president signed each patent personally, but as the volume of sales exploded, this became a physical impossibility. A dedicated secretary was appointed solely for the purpose of signing the president's name to thousands of parchment sheets. These patents were printed on durable sheepskin or heavy vellum, intended to last for centuries. The filling out of a patent was a calligraphic task. The clerk would inscribe the legal description of the land, the name of the patentee, and the certificate number. Finally, the seal of the General Land Office, an impressed wafer of paper and wax, was affixed. These documents were then dispatched via the mail system to the local office for delivery, closing the administrative loop. West of the settled districts, the administration took on a military character, yet the focus remained on logistics rather than combat. The Department of the Quartermaster was the engine that sustained the chain of forts stretching into the interior. These forts were not merely defensive positions. They were warehouses and accounting centers. The quartermaster, at a frontier post, was a keeper of stores. His world was defined by the return of quartermaster stores, a complex form that listed every item of government property under his charge, from axes and anvils to horseshoes and wagons. The supply chain that fed these outposts relied on river transport and heavy wagons. The subsistence of the army, salt pork, flour, beans, vinegar, and whiskey, was procured through contracts issued in the eastern cities. The barrels used for transport were subject to strict specifications regarding the type of wood, usually white oak, the number of hoops, and the method of coopering. A leaking barrel was an administrative failure. Upon arrival at a post, the goods were inspected. A board of survey, consisting of officers, would be convened to examine any damaged provisions. They would smell the pork, taste the flour, and check the weight of the soap. Their findings were written into a report, which served as the voucher for striking the damaged goods from the inventory. The preservation of uniforms and equipage required its own routine. Woolen coats and blankets were susceptible to moths and dampness. The quartermaster's duties included the periodic airing and brushing of the stock. The clothing book recorded the issuance of every jacket, forage cap, and pair of brogans to the individual soldiers. The soldier's signature or mark in the ledger acknowledged receipt, transferring the accountability of the item from the storehouse to the individual. This transfer was the fundamental atom of military administration. the movement of an object across a line of responsibility, marked by ink. River transportation, particularly the steamboat, introduced a new layer of administrative oversight. The rivers were the commercial arteries, and the steamboats were the blood cells. The clerk's office on a steamboat was a small cubicle located near the main cabin. Here, the clerk, often the most powerful figure on the boat after the captain, managed the manifest. Every passenger, every bale of cotton, every crate of machinery had to be recorded. The weigh bill of the river was a running log of transactions occurring at every landing. Wood for fuel was purchased from woodyards along the bank, and the transaction was noted. Freight was discharged and received, with bills of lading exchanged at the gangplank. The federal government's involvement in the rivers extended to the removal of obstructions. The snagboat, a specialized vessel designed to pull sunken trees from the riverbed, was an instrument of infrastructure maintenance. The operations of these boats were tracked through engineering reports. The number of snags removed, the miles of river cleared, and the cost of operation were tabulated. The report of the Chief of Engineers became a yearly volume of increasing thickness, detailing the slow, methodical conquest of the geography through dredging and damming. In the armories and arsenals, the concept of interchangeable parts was beginning to transform the nature of manufacturing and administration simultaneously. The production of a musket was broken down into a series of discrete operations, each performed by a specialized machine or a specialized worker using gauges. The administration of this process required a new kind of record keeping, the time book and the piecework ledger. Inspectors used hardened steel gauges to verify that a trigger guard or a lock plate met the specific tolerances. If a part fit the gauge, it was accepted. If not, it was rejected. The data from these inspections, the rates of rejection, the consumption of iron and coal, the wages paid per piece, were compiled into monthly returns. This was the birth of industrial accounting, where the efficiency of the process was as scrutinized as the final product. The archives of these various departments, land, post, war, treasury, continued to grow, necessitating better methods of binding and preservation. The portfolio became a common tool for temporary storage, two heavy boards connected by a cloth spine, with ties to secure the papers within. For permanent records, the guard book was utilized, where documents were pasted onto stubs in a bound volume to prevent them from becoming loose. The spine of the book was often reinforced with raised bands and covered in calfskin, with red or black leather labels stamped in gold leaf, indicating the department and the year. The ink itself underwent a subtle transition. The reliance on the quill began to wane with the introduction of the steel pen. The steel nib was more durable, held a finer point, and required no knife work. It changed the sound of the office. The soft scratch of the quill was replaced by the sharper, metallic bite of the steel point on paper. The steel pen allowed for a more uniform script, reducing the individual variation in handwriting. A clerk could write for hours without pausing to mend his pen, increasing the volume of output. The pen wiper, a piece of cloth or chamois used to clean the corrosive ink from the steel nib, became a fixture on every desk. As the afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of the government buildings, illuminating the floating dust motes, the clerks continued their silent labor. The scratching of hundreds of pens, the rustle of turning pages, and the occasional thud of a ledger being closed were the only sounds. There was no urgency, only the steady accumulation of facts. The vast, chaotic reality of the expanding nation, The forests, the rivers, the growing cities, the distant forts, was being distilled into a coherent system of paper, stored in the quiet, fireproof rooms of the administration, waiting to be referenced, indexed, and filed. By the late 1830s and into the 1840s, the administrative apparatus of the nation began to harden into a system of specialized bureaus, each operating within its own silo of procedure and precedent. The era of the generalist clerk was fading, replaced by a structure that demanded specific technical knowledge and the adherence to increasingly rigid protocols. The informal intimacy of the early offices was giving way to the architectural permanence of the department, where long corridors lined with identical doors separated the functions of the state into discrete, manageable units of labor. The management of the public revenue underwent a physical transformation during this period with the establishment of the independent treasury system. The government moved away from the reliance on banking corporations and began to construct its own secure repositories for the national wealth. This necessitated a new architecture of security. In the basements of custom houses and sub-treasuries, massive vaults were constructed of granite and iron. These were not merely rooms. They were fortified boxes designed to hold the hard money, the gold and silver specie that was now the preferred medium of federal transaction. The daily routine within a sub-treasury was defined by the physics of heavy metal. The receiving teller stood behind a high counter, often protected by a wire mesh or a brass grill. The sound of the workspace was the distinctive clatter of coins being poured from leather bags onto wooden counting trays. The verification of gold eagles and silver dollars was a tactile process. The teller would inspect the coins for clipping or sweating, methods used by the dishonest to remove small amounts of metal from the edges. Scales of extreme sensitivity, enclosed in glass cases to prevent air currents from affecting the balance, were the final arbiters of value. A discrepancy of a few grains of gold required an immediate adjustment in the ledger. Once counted, the specie was bagged. The standard canvas bag, printed with the Treasury seal, was filled to a specific weight, tied with strong twine, and sealed with hot wax impressed with the teller's personal stamp. These bags were then stacked in the vaults, forming walls of silver and gold. The vault clerk was responsible for the inventory of these stacks. His ledger did not record names or debts, but the physical location of the money. Bin 4, Tier 3, 50 bags of Mexican silver dollars. The humidity of the vaults was a constant concern. The air was often thick and cool, requiring the burning of charcoal braziers to prevent the canvas bags from rotting. While the Treasury guarded the coin, the administration of the coastlines turned to the exact sciences. The United States Coast Survey emerged as the most sophisticated scientific agency of the government, tasked with the mathematical description of the shoreline to ensure the safety of maritime commerce. The work was based on the principle of triangulation, a method that imposed a geometric net over the chaos of the waves and the dunes. The field parties of the Coast Survey operated with the discipline of a military unit but the patience of astronomers. The baseline was the starting point of all measurement. To measure a baseline, which might be 5 to 10 miles long, the surveyors used bars of iron and brass clamped together to compensate for thermal expansion. These bars were placed end-to-end on wooden trestles, leveled with spirit bubbles, and aligned with telescopes. The process was agonizingly slow. A single mile might take weeks to measure, as the equipment had to be protected from the direct sun by canvas tents to prevent the metal from expanding unevenly. Once the base line was established, the primary triangulation began. Signal poles were erected on distant hilltops, often requiring the clearing of timber to open a line of sight. On bright days, the surveyors used heliotropes, devices that used mirrors to reflect the sun toward the observer, to create a distinct point of light visible from miles away. The observer, stationed at a theodolite, would measure the angle between these points of light. The large theodolite was a heavy, precision instrument, carried in a custom-built crate and mounted on a masonry pier isolated from the ground to prevent vibration. The observer would repeat the measurement dozens of times, reversing the telescope and averaging the results to eliminate error. These angles were recorded in field books, columns of degrees, minutes, and seconds that would later be reduced by computers. Men in Washington, who performed the trigonometric calculations to determine the exact latitude and longitude of every point. The result of this labor was the chart. The production of a nautical chart was a process of translation from field notes to copper plate. In the drafting room, the hydrographic data, the soundings of water depth taken by lead line, were plotted. The engraver then took over, working on a polished plate of copper coated with a thin layer of wax. The engraver used a burin to cut the lines of the coast. The depiction of topography was achieved through hassuring, a technique of using short, parallel lines to indicate slope and elevation. The density of the lines corresponded to the steepness of the terrain. A single plate could take months to complete. The printing of the chart was a wet process. The plate was inked, wiped clean so that ink remained only in the grooves, covered with damp paper, and run through a high-pressure roller press. The smell of the Coast Survey office was a mix of chemical etching fluid, printer's ink, and wet paper. In the sphere of Indian affairs, the administration shifted from the factory system to the agency system. The Bureau of Indian Affairs operated as a logistical funnel, managing the distribution of annuities, payments in goods and coin promised by treaty. The Indian agent was the functionary at the end of this chain. His office was often a log structure on the edge of a reservation, filled with the specific paperwork of the Bureau, the roll of tribal members. The census of the tribes was a prerequisite for payment. The agent, often with the help of an interpreter, would compile a list of heads of families. On payment day, the logistics of distribution took over. Crates of goods, blankets, calico cloth, tobacco, gunpowder, and iron tools were opened. These goods had been purchased via contracts in eastern cities, shipped by riverboat and wagon, and stored in the agency warehouse. The invoice of goods was the controlling document. The agent had to verify that the contents of the crates matched the invoice. The distribution was a process of checking names against the roll. An individual would step forward, their identity verified by the chiefs or the interpreter, and they would receive their allotment. If the annuity was in coin, the money was counted out on a table. The recipient would then make their mark, usually an X, next to their name in the ledger. This mark was witnessed by two other individuals who also signed the book. These receipt rolls were the primary vouchers for the agent's accounts. They were sent to Washington, where clerks in the second auditor's office examined them for irregularities. A missing signature or a calculation error could result in the agent's accounts being suspended, leaving him personally liable for the funds. During this period, the technology of the office itself underwent a subtle mechanization. The copying press became a standard fixture, altering the rhythm of correspondence. Previously, Every outgoing letter had to be hand-copied into a letter book. The press allowed for a facsimile to be made instantly. The clerk would write the letter using a special copying ink that contained sugar or gum to keep it moist. A sheet of thin, unsized tissue paper was dampened with water and a brush, then placed over the letter. The two sheets were placed between oil boards and inserted into the iron press. A heavy screw was turned by a horizontal handle, applying immense pressure. The ink would bleed through to the tissue paper, creating a reverse image that could be read through the back of the thin sheet. This process introduced a new routine of damping and pressing. The letter book was no longer a book of handwriting, but a book of pasted tissue copies. The quality of the copy depended on the precise dampness of the tissue. Too dry and the ink would not transfer, too wet and the original letter would blur. The press stand, a sturdy table built to withstand the torque of the screw, became the center of the mail room. The air around it smelled of damp paper and the sweet, metallic scent of the copying ink. The administration of the sick and injured seamen created another specialized paper trail through the Marine Hospital Service. This was the first federal system of social insurance, funded by a mandatory deduction from the wages of sailors. The collector of customs acted as the agent for this fund. Every master of a vessel was required to present a crew list upon return from a voyage. The collector would calculate the number of months each sailor had been employed and assess the tax, 20 cents per month. These collections were recorded in a separate abstract, monies retained from the wages of seamen. When a sailor fell ill, he would apply to the collector for a permit of admission to a marine hospital. This permit was a bureaucratic diagnosis. It certified that the bearer was a registered seaman who had paid his dues. The hospitals themselves, located in key ports like Norfolk, New Orleans, and Boston, were run by stewards who managed the provision of food and medicine. The steward kept a diet book, recording the rations issued to each patient, and a prescription book, logging the medicines dispensed. The system was circular. The tax collected at the custom house paid for the gruel and the laudanum in the hospital ward. The expansion of the postal network began to intersect with the nascent technology of the railroad. The route agent was a new class of postal employee who worked not in a stationary office, but in a moving rail car. The traveling post office was a small compartment at the front of the train, fitted with sorting racks that swayed with the motion of the engine. The agent's job was to receive mail bags at each station without the train stopping. This was achieved through the use of the mail crane, a device on the platform that held the bag suspended, and a catcher arm on the train car that snatched the bag at speed. Inside the car, the work was frantic and hazardous. The agent had to sort the mail for the upcoming stations before the train arrived. The lighting was poor, provided by swinging oil lamps that cast moving shadows over the pigeonholes. The dust and soot from the locomotive engine permeated the compartment, coating the letters in a fine gray grit. The agent's schedule was ruled by the railroad timetable, a document that possessed a rigidity unknown to the stagecoach era. The integration of the mail with the rail schedule meant that administrative time was becoming synchronized across vast distances. A delay in the sorting car meant a failure of the connection at the terminus. In the General Land Office, the volume of land patents required a reorganization of storage. The tract books were becoming so numerous that they required reinforced flooring to support their weight. The Commissioner of the General Land Office presided over a backlog of unissued patents that could stretch for years. To manage this, the office introduced a system of suspended entries, creating a holding category for claims that were legally ambiguous. These files were wrapped in red tape and placed in specific pigeonholes labeled suspended. They represented a bureaucratic limbo, where the land was occupied but not legally owned, waiting for a ruling that might take a decade to arrive. The physical environment of the clerk was also changing with the introduction of the standing desk. To accommodate the large ledgers, which could be 2 feet wide when open, tall, sloped desks were constructed, clerks spent their days perched on high stools or standing, a posture that was believed to be more conducive to the alertness required for long columns of addition. The spittoon, or cuspidor, became a ubiquitous item of furniture, usually made of brass or ceramic, placed at the foot of the desk. The cleaning of these vessels was a daily task for the office messengers, a grim routine that underpinned the sanitary conditions of the department. As the sun set, the government buildings were no longer entirely dark. The introduction of better lighting meant that work could theoretically continue later, though the custom of the afternoon clerk, often a second job holder or a copyist paid by the word, began to emerge. The silence of the evening office was different now. It was the silence of a machine that had been briefly paused. The vaults were locked, the combinations to the new dial locks, an innovation replacing the heavy iron keys, were secured in the minds of the chief clerks, and the copy press was tightened down one last time to ensure the night's batch of letters was preserved. The system had become a permanent physical presence, a structure of iron, paper, and stone that operated independently of the men who tended it. By the middle of the 19th century, the administrative structure of the nation underwent a significant consolidation with the establishment of the Department of the Interior, often referred to as the Home Department. This new entity was designed to relieve the pressure on the older departments by absorbing the disparate bureaus that managed the domestic sphere. The creation of this department was not merely a legislative act, but a massive logistical migration. The General Land Office was detached from the Treasury. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was severed from the War Department, and the Patent Office was brought under this new umbrella. The physical movement of these bureaus involved the cartage of tons of paper through the streets of the capital. Wagons loaded with boxes of land patents, treaty rolls, and patent models trundled between buildings, overseen by chief clerks who guarded the continuity of the filing systems during the transit. The new department was a conglomerate of functions, housing the surveyors of the wilderness alongside the examiners of machinery and the agents of the tribes. This centralization required a new hierarchy of oversight. The Secretary of the Interior now presided over a diverse kingdom of paper, requiring a standardized system of reporting to harmonize the operations of geologists, census takers, and pension clerks. The architecture of administration began to reflect this newfound permanence. The Patent Office Building, a massive structure of marble and granite, stood as a temple to the filing system. Its galleries were lined with display cases, and its corridors were designed to be fireproof, with vaulted masonry ceilings and floors of stone. The model room in the Patent Office became a silent gallery of American ingenuity, where thousands of miniature machines sat in glass cabinets, tagged and numbered. The administration of this space required a staff of curators and cleaners to dust the models and ensure the labels remained legible. The air within these halls was cool and still, preserving the wood and brass of the models from the humidity of the river valley. Within the pension office, The workload was dictated by the aftermath of the recent conflict with Mexico. The bounty land warrants, grants of public land given to veterans in lieu of, or in addition to, cash created a surge of paperwork. The application for a warrant was a formalized legal process. The veteran had to swear an affidavit before a justice of the peace, detailing his service, his regiment, and his discharge. These documents, often written on blue-lined foolscap, flowed into the office in Washington by the thousands. The examination of a pension claim was a forensic audit. The clerk had to cross-reference the soldier's affidavit with the muster rolls of the War Department. If the name on the claim did not match the spelling on the muster roll, or if the dates of service were off by a single day, the claim was suspended. The suspension clerk drafted a form letter explaining the discrepancy, which was mailed back to the applicant. This cycle of correspondence could last for years. The files grew thick with affidavits, witness statements, and surgeon certificates describing wounds or disabilities. These bundles were tied with red tape and stored in the high shelves of the office, a growing archive of physical trauma translated into administrative procedure. A new technology began to intrude upon the silence of the writing rooms, the magnetic telegraph. While not yet on every desk, the telegraph office became a critical node in the government's communication network. The telegraph operator was a new breed of functionary, possessing a technical skill distinct from the penmanship of the copyist. The sound of the administration began to change. The scratching of the pen was joined by the rhythmic clicking of the brass sounder. The telegram imposed a new discipline of brevity. Unlike the flowery prose of the official letter, the telegram was charged by the word. Messages were stripped of salutations and honorifics, reduced to the bare essential facts. A telegraphic dispatch was received on a strip of paper tape or written out by the operator on a specific form, usually printed on yellow paper. These dispatches were treated with immediate priority, bypassing the slow sorting of the standard mail. The messenger boy, often a youth employed specifically to run these urgent slips of paper between offices, became a fixture of the corridors. The lighting of the offices underwent a transition from oil to gas. The installation of gas pipes involved the drilling of walls and the fitting of brass brackets. The gas fitter became a necessary contractor. In the winter evenings, the offices were now illuminated by the steady, hissing flame of the gas jet. This light was brighter and more constant than the flicker of candles, allowing for longer working hours, but it consumed the oxygen in the room and added a chemical tang to the air. The glass globe that shielded the flame had to be cleaned of soot regularly. The danger of fire shifted from the sparked ember to the leaking pipe, necessitating a new set of safety protocols regarding the turning of valves at the end of the day. The printing of government documents was becoming an industrial operation. The public printer was responsible for producing the massive volume of congressional reports, executive documents, and forms. The Congressional Globe, the record of debates, was set in type by teams of compositors working at high speed. The proofreader sat in a quiet corner of the printing house, reading aloud from the copy while another checked the galley proof, a monotonous chant of legislation and statistics. The wet sheets of printed paper were hung on racks to dry before being folded and stitched. The bindery was a factory of glue and leather, where the loose pages were transformed into the heavy, bound volumes that would line the shelves of the bureaus. In the Treasury, the management of the sub-treasuries became more rigorous. The transfer of funds between cities was no longer just a matter of wagons, but of transfer drafts. These were financial instruments that allowed the government to move credit without moving physical gold. The drafting clerk drew up these orders, which were signed by the treasurer and countersigned by the register. The paper used for these drafts was of the highest quality, often watermarked and engraved with intricate lathework to prevent forgery. The Counterfeit Detector, a published guide describing known fake notes and altered drafts, was a reference book kept on the teller's counter, its pages worn from constant consultation. The Department of State continued to manage the external relations of the nation through the dispatch bag. The diplomatic correspondence was numbered sequentially. A dispatch number 45 from the minister in London would be received, opened, and docketed, a summary of its contents written on the back, before being entered into the register of dispatches. The cipher clerk handled the encoding and decoding of sensitive instructions. Using a code book or a cipher wheel, the clerk would translate the secretary's instructions into strings of numbers or nonsense words for transmission. This work required absolute concentration and secrecy. The code books were kept in locked safes, accessible only to a select few. The census of 1850 introduced a new level of granularity to the administrative view of the population. For the first time, the census recorded the name of every free person, not just the head of the household. This exponential increase in data required a larger staff of tabulators in Washington. These clerks worked with large tally sheets, making hash marks to count the population by age, sex, profession, and place of birth. The statistics of mortality, agriculture, and manufacturing were compiled in separate schedules. The work was purely numerical, a manual computation of the nation's human and economic capital. The final product was a set of thick quarto volumes, bound in black cloth, that offered a statistical mirror of the country. The supply clerk or stationary clerk in each department managed the consumables of bureaucracy. The inventory of goods was specific. Reams of foolscap, bundles of quills still used alongside steel pens, bottles of mucilage, a gum adhesive, sealing wax, red tape, and pounce, a fine powder used to dry ink. The requisition form was the currency of this internal economy. A clerk needing a new ledger had to fill out a requisition, have it signed by his section chief, and present it to the supply room. This strict control prevented waste and theft. The supply room smelled of dry paper, cedar pencils, and the sharp scent of ink. Sanitation within the government buildings was rudimentary but structured. The water cooler, a ceramic or metal tank with a spigot, often supplied with ice delivered by wagon, became a gathering point. The cleaning staff, often women who worked before and after the official hours, scrubbed the pine floors and dusted the desks. The heating of the buildings relied on coal, delivered in chutes to the cellar. The fireman, or stoker, was responsible for maintaining the furnaces or the coal stoves in individual rooms. The rattle of the coal bucket and the smell of sulfur were part of the sensory landscape of the winter office. The dead letter office continued to evolve, developing a museum of sorts for the strange objects found in undeliverable mail. The blind reader was a specialist clerk skilled in deciphering illegible handwriting. These men could interpret the most chaotic scrawls, deducing the destination from the faintest clues of geography and phonetics. It was a puzzle-solving exercise performed in silence. If a letter could be deciphered, it was readdressed and sent on its way. If not, it went to the shredder. In the custom houses, the appraiser gained prominence. As tariffs became more complex, the need to determine the precise value and nature of imported goods increased. The appraiser's store was a warehouse where bales of cotton, crates of French wine, and boxes of English hardware were opened and inspected. The appraiser used chemical tests to determine the purity of dyes or the alcohol content of spirits. His findings were recorded in the invoice description, which determined the duty to be paid. This was technical administration, requiring knowledge of chemistry, textiles, and global prices. The filing system itself became a subject of study. The vertical file had not yet appeared. Papers were still largely folded and stored flat in bundles. However, the use of indices became more sophisticated. The card index began to make tentative appearances, where individual names or subjects were written on small cards and arranged alphabetically in drawers. This allowed for faster retrieval than the bound index book, which could not be easily reordered. The card catalog was a revolutionary step in data management, breaking the information down into mobile, modular units. As the decade wore on, the sense of a permanent, professional class of civil servants began to form. Men spent their entire lives in the service of a single bureau, slowly rising from a copyist to a clerk of the third class. They knew the history of every regulation and the location of every file. Their personal lives were entwined with the rhythm of the department. They walked the same streets, sat at the same desks, and wrote in the same ledgers year after year. The administration was a machine that ran on the fuel of their daily, repetitive labor, a silent engine of order constructing the framework of a continental power. As the decade of the 1860s opened, the administrative machinery of the nation faced a sudden, exponential demand for capacity. The existing frameworks of the peacetime bureaucracy, designed for a constabulary army and a modest coastal revenue, were rapidly disassembled and reconstructed into an engine of industrial-scale logistics. The quiet counting houses and the slow-moving land offices were overshadowed by the rise of the depot and the bureau. The scale of operation shifted from the ledger book to the warehouse, and the unit of measure changed from the individual crate to the train load. The Quartermaster General's department became the central nervous system of this new logistical reality. The procurement of material was no longer a matter of local contracts, but of massive, centralized manufacturing. The depot system was established in major rail hubs: Philadelphia, Cincinnati, St. Louis. These depots were vast cities of storage, consisting of row upon row of wooden warehouses, hastily constructed of unpainted pine. Inside, the categorization of goods was rigorous. There were warehouses solely for forage, stacked high with bales of hay and sacks of oats, warehouses for equipage, filled with mess kits, canteens, and axes, and warehouses for textiles, smelling of raw wool and dye. The clothing establishment within the depot operated as a factory of uniformity. The cutting room was the first stage of production. Here, cutters used long knives or mechanical shears to slice through layers of indigo-dyed wool, following brass-bound patterns for greatcoats and sack coats. These cut pieces were bundled and issued to seamstresses, thousands of women working either in government sewing rooms or in their own homes on a piecework basis. The administration of this labor required a complex system of accountability. Each bundle of fabric was weighed before issuance, and the finished garments were weighed upon return to ensure no cloth had been pilfered. The inspector of clothing stood at the receiving counter, examining the stitching and the fit. Garments were graded, folded, and baled in a hydraulic press, then bound with iron hoops for transport. The motive power for this logistical machine was the horse and the mule. The remount depots were administrative centers for livestock. Tens of thousands of animals were purchased, branded with the U.S. mark and corralled. The descriptive role of animals was a ledger recording the age, height, color, and markings of every horse. The veterinary care was rudimentary but organized. Farriers were employed to shoe the animals, and their consumption of iron and coal was tracked. The sheer volume of manure produced in these depots created a sanitary challenge that required a dedicated workforce of sweepers and carters to manage. The smell of the depot was a dense atmosphere of wet wool, horse sweat, leather, and feed. The railroad, previously a commercial patchwork, was brought under a unified system of control known as the United States Military Railroads. This was an administrative takeover of the tracks, the rolling stock, and the timetables. The railroad superintendent possessed absolute authority over the movement of trains within his sector. The timetable became a military directive. The movement of troops and supplies was choreographed on a string chart, a graphical representation of time and distance where trains were plotted as diagonal lines. The intersection of lines represented a meeting point where one train had to take the siding. Precision was paramount. A delay of 10 minutes could ripple through the system, causing gridlock 50 miles away. To manage the trains, the conductor carried a specific set of orders and a train sheet. The cars themselves were numbered and tracked. Boxcar number 405 might be recorded in a ledger in Alexandria as carrying 200 barrels of salt pork. The loading manifest was nailed to the door of the car. At the destination, the receiving clerk checked the seal on the door, a twisted wire secured with a lead stamp, before breaking it. If the seal was intact but the contents were short, the liability fell on the loading depot. If the seal was broken, the liability fell on the railroad. This chain of custody was maintained through a blizzard of waybills and receipts. Communication across this sprawling network relied on the military telegraph corps. The telegraph had evolved from a novelty to the primary instrument of command and control. The telegraph wagon was a mobile office, a horse-drawn vehicle equipped with batteries, sounders, and spools of insulated wire. As the construction crews advanced, often stringing wire on trees or fence posts when poles were unavailable, the operator sat in the wagon, tapping out reports. The cipher became the language of security. Specialized cipher disks, or code books, were used to encrypt messages. The text was broken into arbitrary groups of words, with blind words inserted to confuse interception. The cipher clerk at the receiving end would reverse the process, translating the nonsense back into intelligible orders. The sound of the telegraph key, a rapid, metallic clicking, was the background noise of every headquarters and depot office. The recruitment of manpower required a new bureaucratic invention, the Provost Marshal General's Bureau. This entity was tasked with the administration of the draft, a process that transformed the citizenry into a pool of potential conscripts. The enrollment officer went house to house, much like a census taker, compiling lists of eligible men. These lists were consolidated by district. The draft lottery was a mechanical ritual of selection. Names were written on cards, placed in envelopes, and deposited into a draft wheel, a hollow, rotating drum often made of wood or brass. On the day of the draft, the wheel was turned to shuffle the envelopes. A drawer, often a blindfolded person, would reach in and pull out a card. The name was read aloud and recorded by a clerk in the draft book. The selected individual was then notified by a printed form delivered to his residence. The administration of exemptions was a parallel process. Medical boards were established to examine those claiming physical disability. The surgeon's report, was a detailed description of the ailment hernia, poor eyesight, missing teeth, filed with the enrollment board. The payment of commutation or the hiring of a substitute involved significant financial transactions, all recorded in the Bureau's ledgers. The substitute broker emerged as a commercial intermediary whose contracts were scrutinized by the provost marshals. To finance this immense expenditure, the Treasury Department underwent a radical transformation with the introduction of greenbacks, federal paper currency not backed by specie. The production of this money took place in the Printing Bureau, located in the attic of the Treasury Building. This was a factory of high security and heavy industry. The engraving room was where master craftsmen cut the intricate dies for the notes, using geometric lathes to create complex, uncopyable patterns. The transfer press was used to move the image from the die to the printing plate. The printing itself was a wet plate process. The paper, a specialized linen blend, was dampened in a wetting room to make it receptive to the ink. The plate printers, utilizing hand-turned roller presses, inked the plates, wiped them clean with cloth in the palm of their hand, a technique requiring years of practice, and fed the paper through. The sheets were printed with 4 notes to a page. After printing, the sheets were dried in a heated room. The trimming and separating was performed by women using large shears or mechanical cutters. The final stage was the sealing, where the Treasury seal was overprinted in red ink. The counting of the notes was obsessive. Every sheet was counted at every stage of the process. A missing sheet triggered an immediate lockdown of the building. The smell of the Printing Bureau was a pungent mix of oil, ink, damp paper, and hot metal. The Internal Revenue System was established to collect the new income tax and excise duties. The assessor was the official who determined the value of property and income. He carried a large portfolio of forms, visiting businesses to gauge their production. The stamp tax required the affixing of revenue stamps to a vast array of documents, contracts, mortgages, wills, and even photographs. The cancellation of these stamps, usually by writing the date and initials across the face, was a legal requirement. The collector received the tax payments, issuing elaborate receipts. The paperwork of taxation began to permeate everyday commercial life, creating a continuous paper trail of transactions. Medical logistics were professionalized under the pressure of mass casualties. The medical department and the Civilian Sanitary Commission worked to systematize the care of the sick. The General Hospital was no longer a temporary ward but a planned facility, often built on the pavilion principle, long, detached wooden barracks arranged to maximize ventilation. The administration of a hospital involved the Register of Patients, a book recording the name, rank, diagnosis, and disposition of every man. The diet kitchen was managed by a matron who followed specific diet tables prescribed by the surgeons. The movement of the sick was managed by hospital trains. These were specialized rolling stock, boxcars fitted with tiers of suspended bunks to dampen the vibration of the tracks. The medical director of the railroad line coordinated the schedule of these trains to avoid congestion. The hospital steamer was the riverine equivalent, a boat refitted with wards, laundry facilities, and an operating room. The clerk of the boat maintained the manifest of patients, updating it as men were loaded at landing stages or discharged at base hospitals. The burial records were a grim necessity. The location of graves was marked on site plats, and the personal effects of the deceased were inventoried and packaged for return to the family. Photography became an administrative tool for the first time. The official photographer traveled with the engineering or quartermaster corps. The wet plate collodion process was cumbersome, requiring a portable darkroom wagon. The glass plates were coated with chemicals, exposed in the camera while still wet, and developed immediately. These photographs were used to document the construction of bridges, the layout of fortifications, and the topography of the land. The stereoscopic view became a popular format, but for the engineers, the large format print was a technical record of infrastructure. The sheer volume of correspondence required the expansion of the clerical force in Washington. The copyist role began to open up to women, who were hired to transcribe letters and records in the Treasury and other departments. This introduced a change in the social dynamic of the office. The ladies' room became a necessary architectural addition. The sound of the office was now a mix of male and female voices, though the work remained strictly segregated and hierarchical. The file room grew into a labyrinth of floor-to-ceiling shelves. To reach the upper tiers, rolling ladders were installed. The briefing of letters, folding them, and writing a summary on the back remained the standard method of filing. In the armories, the production of rifled muskets was driven by the gauging system. Every component, the lock plate, the tumbler, the sear, the barrel, was checked against a set of limit gauges. These gauges defined the acceptable tolerance for each dimension. A part that did not fit the gauge was rejected. This interchangeability allowed for the mass repair of weapons in the field. A repair depot could cannibalize parts from damaged muskets to assemble functional ones. The ordnance returns, submitted by regimental quartermasters, accounted for every cartridge and cap expended. The waste of ammunition was tracked and often deducted from the allocation. The military commission became a standard administrative tribunal for occupied areas. These commissions operated with the formality of a court, with a judge advocate recording the proceedings. The transcripts were written out verbatim, tied with ribbon, and forwarded to the Judge Advocate General for review. The Provost Court handled minor offenses, functioning as a municipal court in cities under martial law. The pass system regulated the movement of civilians. A provost pass was a slip of paper granting permission to travel between specific points for a specific time. The provost guard at checkpoints inspected these passes, checking the description of the bearer against the person standing before them. As the years of the mid-century conflict ground on, the landscape was marked not just by earthworks but by the debris of administration. Broken wagons, discarded crates, and piles of worn-out horseshoes surrounded the depots. The paper accumulated in the Capitol became a physical burden on the structures. Floors sagged under the weight of the returns, the muster rolls, and the vouchers. The government had become a vast, information processing engine, consuming raw materials and data, and outputting orders and supplies. The rhythm of the administration was the rhythm of the steam engine and the telegraph key, a relentless mechanical pulse that continued day and night, ignoring the seasons and the sun, driving the logistics of the nation with the cold precision of a piston. In the years immediately following the cessation of major hostilities in the late 1860s, the administrative momentum of the nation did not decelerate. Rather, it inverted its flow. The colossal machinery that had been constructed to assemble armies and material was now repurposed for the intricate, tedious work of dismantling them. The Great Muster Out was a logistical operation of reverse engineering. It was not merely a matter of soldiers walking away. It was a bureaucratic process of accounting for every musket, every blanket, and every month of pay owed. The muster-out roll became the defining document of the era. These large sheets, often 3 feet in length, required the signature of the company commander and the paymaster. They listed the soldier's history, battles fought, wounds received, equipment lost, and stoppages of pay for minor offenses. The processing of these rolls took place in temporary pavilions and repurposed warehouses, where paymasters sat behind tables stacked with greenbacks. The final statement was the soldier's discharge paper, a certificate that severed his legal bond to the government. To receive it, he had to return his ordnance. The ordnance officer stood by crates and barrels, accepting the return of rifles. Each weapon was inspected. If the lock was broken or the stock shattered, a value was assessed and deducted from the soldier's final pay. This liquidation of government property resulted in vast surplus stockpiles. The auction block became a standard administrative tool. Auctions of government property were advertised in newspapers, listing thousands of mules, wagons, and harnesses. The auctioneer's return recorded the sale price of each item, channeling the proceeds back into the shrinking treasury. As the armies dissolved, a new and permanent bureaucracy rose to manage the legacy of the conflict, the Pension Bureau. This institution rapidly became the largest single administrative agency in the federal government. Its operations were housed in a series of overcrowded buildings, eventually necessitating a dedicated palace of red brick and terracotta. The pension file was the atomic unit of this system. A claim for a pension based on disability required a declaration from the veteran, supported by the affidavits of 2 comrades who had witnessed the injury, and a certificate from a civilian surgeon. The Medical Review Board within the Pension Bureau was a tribunal of anatomy. Clerks and doctors pored over anatomical charts and written descriptions of trauma. They developed a rating schedule that assigned a specific dollar value to every conceivable injury. The loss of a hand was worth a certain amount per month, the loss of an eye, another, chronic diarrhea or rheumatism, yet another. The pension certificate, once approved, was a beautifully engraved document enclosed in a metal canister or a sturdy envelope. The payment of these pensions was decentralized to pension agencies across the country, where pension agents dispersed the funds quarterly. The quarterly voucher had to be executed by the pensioner, often before a notary, to prove he was still alive. Simultaneously, the administration of the South fell under the jurisdiction of the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. This agency attempted to impose a contractual framework on a society in flux. The labor contract was the central instrument. Bureau agents, operating out of field offices in courthouses or tents, drafted contracts between landowners and freedmen. These documents stipulated the wages, the shares of the crop, and the provision of food and clothing. The agent acted as the registrar and the arbiter, keeping a contract book where the terms were summarized. The educational efforts of the Bureau involved the school report. Teachers in the new schools were required to submit monthly forms detailing attendance, the number of pupils spelling, reading, and writing, and the amount of tuition paid by the parents. These statistical returns were aggregated to measure the progress of literacy. The Bureau also operated a banking system, the Freedmen's Savings Bank. This institution required the infrastructure of a commercial bank, passbooks, ledgers, and signature cards. The signature card often contained detailed biographical data, names of children, place of birth, name of former master, to identify depositors who might be illiterate. The collapse of this bank later would create its own mountain of liquidation paperwork, with receivers appointed to manage the dissolving assets. In the West, the completion of the transcontinental rail link transformed the General Land Office into a partner of the railroad corporations. The land grant system created a checkerboard pattern of ownership extending for miles on either side of the track. The railroads received the odd-numbered sections. The government retained the even-numbered ones. The administration of this dual ownership was complex. The railroads established their own land departments with land commissioners, who functioned exactly like government officials. They issued brochures and circulars enticing settlers, and they maintained their own tract books. The surveyor's task in these regions was to demarcate the railroad limit. The adjustment of land grants was a slow process of verifying that the railroad had actually built the track to the required standard before the title to the land was conveyed. Commissioners of inspection were appointed by the government to ride the line, checking the grade, the ballast, and the bridges. Their reports were technical audits. If a section of track was accepted, the certification of lands could proceed. This involved the listing of thousands of acres by legal description, a list that was checked against the tract books to ensure no prior claims existed. The Department of Agriculture began to formalize its operations, moving beyond mere statistics to the physical distribution of biological capital. The Congressional Seed Distribution became a massive logistical program. Congressmen provided lists of constituents, and the department mailed packets of vegetable and flower seeds to thousands of rural addresses. The seed room was a factory of packaging, where women sat at long tables measuring out ounces of turnip or cabbage seed into small envelopes. These envelopes were pasted shut, labeled and bagged for the post. The entomologist and the botanist became permanent civil servants. The report of the entomologist detailed the life cycles of pests like the boll worm, illustrated with precise lithographs. These reports were printed by the thousands and franked through the mail to farmers. The observation of the weather was professionalized under the Army Signal Service. The Division of Telegrams and Reports for the Benefit of Commerce established a network of observer sergeants across the continent. These men were trained in the use of the barometer, the wet bulb and dry bulb thermometer, and the anemometer. The observation station was a small office, often on the roof of a high building in a city. At specific synchronized times, 7:35 a.m., 4:35 p.m., and 11:35 p.m. Washington time, the observer would take his readings. The data was immediately telegraphic. The circuit system of the telegraph was cleared of all other traffic to allow the weather reports to pass. The weather code was a cipher designed for brevity. A single word might convey the barometric pressure, the temperature, and the wind direction. In the central office in Washington, these reports were received and decoded. The map clerk would then plot the data on a large outline map of the United States. Isobars were drawn to connect points of equal pressure. Based on this map, the indications, the forecast, were written out. These indications were telegraphed to the press and to rural post offices, where they were displayed as farmers' bulletins. The cautionary signal, a red flag with a black square, was hoisted at ports to warn of approaching storms. This was the first time the atmosphere was administered as a national system. The Treasury Department, dealing with the massive war debt, developed a factory-like process for the management of bonds. The bond division was a fortress of secure paper. The bonds were printed with coupons attached, small rectangles of paper that the holder would clip off and present for interest payments. The redemption of these coupons was a physical task. Sacks of clipped coupons arrived from banks. Counters, mostly women, sat at tables arranging the coupons by loan issue and denomination. They were counted, bundled, and canceled with a punch. The Register of the Treasury had to account for every coupon to prevent fraud. The macerator was introduced as a method of destruction, a large vat where canceled bonds and notes were ground into a pulp, which was then pressed into souvenirs or bricks. The technology of the office began to shift with the introduction of the typewriter. The early machines manufactured by Remington were heavy cast-iron devices, often mounted on sewing machine stands with a treadle to return the carriage. The operator was a new specialist. The sound of the office changed from the scratch of the pen to the staccato clatter of the keys. The typewriter did not immediately replace the pen. Ledgers were still handwritten, but it revolutionized correspondence. The carbon paper allowed for the simultaneous creation of a transcript, eliminating the need for the damp press. The typed letter was initially viewed with suspicion, lacking the personal authority of the hand, but its legibility and speed made it indispensable for the growing volume of business. The file holder, or document file, began to replace the bundle. These were vertical boxes made of cardboard or metal, designed to hold papers flat rather than folded. The filing cabinet with pull-out drawers emerged as a piece of furniture. The index card system became more robust. The Dewey Decimal System, though a library invention, influenced the classification of administrative subjects. Papers were increasingly filed by number rather than by name. The subject index allowed a clerk to find all correspondence relating to a specific topic, say, Lighthouse's lens procurement, without knowing the names of the correspondents. The civil service itself became a subject of administration. The spoils system, where clerks were appointed based on political patronage, began to chafe against the need for technical competence. The Civil Service Commission was tentatively established to create a barrier of merit. The examination became a gateway. Applicants for clerkships had to sit in a room and answer questions on arithmetic, geography, and grammar. Their papers were graded, and an eligible list was created. This introduced the concept of the probationary period and the efficiency rating. Department heads began to keep records of the punctuality and output of their staff. The internal architecture of the government buildings evolved to handle the paper load. The dumbwaiter was installed to move files between floors. The speaking tube allowed for voice communication between offices without a messenger. Pneumatic tubes, systems of pressurized air pipes, began to be used to shoot capsules containing cash or memos across large rooms or between buildings. The time clock made its appearance in the Navy yards and arsenals, a mechanical observer of the workers' arrival and departure. The life-saving service on the coasts was organized into a chain of stations, each manned by a keeper and a crew of surfmen. Their routine was governed by the patrol. Every night, regardless of weather, a surfman walked the beach to a halfway point where he exchanged a check or token with the patrol from the neighboring station to prove he had made the distance. The station log recorded the weather, the patrols, and any wrecks. The drill with the breeches buoy and the Lyle gun, a small cannon used to fire a line to a stranded ship, was practiced weekly and recorded. In the rapidly expanding cities, the postal carrier service was introduced. No longer did citizens have to go to the post office. The post office came to them. This required the numbering of houses and the naming of streets, an administrative ordering of the urban landscape. The carrier in his gray uniform walked a specific route, timed to the minute. The street letter box of cast iron was installed on corners, allowing for the collection of mail at all hours. The collection schedule was painted on the box. The patent office continued to grow, but the requirement for models was eventually dropped as the volume became unmanageable. The transition to a purely paper record, drawings and specifications, changed the nature of the archive. The official Gazette of the United States Patent Office was published weekly, a dense catalog of the week's inventions, containing reduced engravings of the drawings. This publication was distributed to libraries and courthouses, creating a national database of technical knowledge. As the decade closed, the administration had become a pervasive, background hum in the life of the nation. It was present in the weather forecast in the morning paper, the mail carrier on the stoop, the stamp on the cigar box, and the pension check in the envelope. The chaotic energy of the frontier and the industrial city was being slowly captured, measured, and filed by the silent army of clerks, working under the gaslights, their fingers stained with the purple ink of the typewriter ribbon and the red dust of the decaying rubber bands. In the early years of the 1880s, the administrative character of the state began to shift from the chaotic patronage of the post-war years toward a structured statutory permanence. The era of the spoils system, where clerical positions were distributed as rewards for political loyalty, was slowly yielding to the merit system. This transition was not immediate, but it introduced a new ritual to the bureaucratic life: the competitive examination. The entry into government service was no longer secured solely by a letter of recommendation from a ward boss, but by the quiet scratching of a pen in a proctored hall. The Civil Service Commission, established to oversee this transition, operated as a gatekeeper of competence. The examination room was a space of enforced silence and standardization. Rows of wooden desks were occupied by applicants who bent over printed sheets of questions. The curriculum of the state was specific: orthography, arithmetic, interest calculations, and the geography of the Union. The monitor paced the aisles, ensuring that no crib sheets were used. Completed examinations were collected, sealed, and graded by boards of examiners. The result was the eligible register, a ranked list of names from which appointments were mandatory. This system created a new class of classified employees, men and women whose tenure was protected from the caprice of election cycles. The concept of time itself underwent a rigorous administrative standardization during this decade. The Day of Two Noons in 1883 marked the moment when the chaotic local times, based on the solar noon of each town, were collapsed into 4 rigid standard time zones. This was a change driven by the logistical necessities of the railroad, but it was adopted by the federal administration as the operating rhythm of the continent. The General Time Convention was the body that adjudicated the boundaries of these zones. In the government offices, the master clock became the ultimate authority. The transmission of the time signal from the Naval Observatory was a daily administrative event. At noon, a telegraphic signal was sent out across the wires, dropping time balls in port cities and synchronizing the pendulums of the department clocks. The timekeeper in the large bureaus recorded the attendance of the workforce with increasing precision. The tardy list became a disciplinary tool, and the time sheet linked the hours of presence directly to the payroll ledger. The regulation of commerce began to take the form of an independent agency with the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission. This was a new species of administration, designed not just to record, but to adjudicate. The hearing room of the commission was a quasi-judicial space where the abstract forces of economics were debated. Railroad corporations were required to file their rate schedules with the commission. These schedules, printed on large tariff sheets, flooded the offices in Washington. The rate room was a library of pricing, where clerks filed the tariffs of thousands of carriers. The work involved the detection of discrimination, the charging of different rates for the same haul. The long-haul short-haul clause was a mathematical puzzle for the examiners. Stenographers, using the shorthand systems of Pittman or Gregg, recorded the testimony of railroad presidents and disgruntled shippers. The transcript became the central document of regulation. These typed volumes were bound and indexed, forming a case law of logistics. The Commission's decisions were published in reports, dense volumes of legal and economic reasoning that attempted to impose order on the competitive friction of the rails. The physical infrastructure of the Navy was undergoing a transition from wood and canvas to steel and steam, a shift that required a complete overhaul of naval administration. The Bureau of Steam Engineering and the Bureau of Construction and Repair became centers of technical drafting. The blueprint, the cyanotype, replaced the hand-drawn plan. The smell of the drafting room was now the smell of ammonia and chemically treated paper. These blue sheets with white lines allowed for the rapid reproduction of complex engineering drawings. The procurement of armor plate for the new steel ships involved a rigorous system of testing at the proving ground. A sample plate, selected at random from a manufacturer's lot, was bolted to a heavy timber backing and fired upon by a naval gun. The ballistic test was documented by photography and detailed measurement. The depth of the impact, the cracking of the steel, and the condition of the projectile were recorded in the firing log. If the sample failed, the entire lot was rejected. This inspection by sample was a statistical method of quality control that governed the industrial production of the new Navy. The steel mills, located far from the ocean, were now integrated into the administrative perimeter of the fleet, with resident naval inspectors signing off on the chemical composition of the ingots. On the western frontier, the administration of Indian affairs moved toward the policy of allotment, a bureaucratic process designed to dismantle the communal landholding of the tribes. The Dawes Act necessitated a massive surveying effort. The allotting agent arrived on the reservation with a team of surveyors and a roll of the tribe. The land was sliced into 160-acre parcels for heads of households. The field work involved the physical staking of these plots in a landscape that had never known fences. The agent carried a trust patent book. Each allottee was assigned a specific plot, described by section and range. The Competency Commission was a traveling tribunal that determined if an individual was competent to manage his own affairs and thus receive the fee simple title to his land, which often led to its immediate sale. The heirship files began to grow as original allottees died. The division of a 160-acre allotment among a dozen heirs created a fractionalized paper trail of immense complexity. The lease clerk managed the leasing of these Indian lands to white ranchers and farmers, collecting the rents and distributing them to the individual accounts of the tribal members. This system transformed the agent into a banker and a real estate manager, overseeing a ledger of diminishing assets. The administration of immigration was moving from state control to federal jurisdiction. The immigration station was becoming a processing factory. The manifest of the arriving steamship was the primary control document. The captain was required to swear to the accuracy of the list, which included the name, age, occupation, and nationality of every passenger. The medical inspection line was the first filter. Doctors of the Marine Hospital Service stood at the head of the stairs, watching the ascent of the immigrants. They used chalk to mark the lapels of those suspected of disease. H for heart, L for lungs, E for eyes. The Board of Special Inquiry sat in a small room to adjudicate the cases of those detained. The proceedings were administrative hearings, where the immigrant was questioned through an interpreter. The minutes of these inquiries were recorded, often determining whether a family would be admitted or deported. The detention room was a holding pen for those awaiting a decision or a return voyage. The statistical output of the Immigration Service was categorized by race or people, a classification system that fed into the national debate on demographics. In the cities, the municipal administration was professionalizing the management of the urban environment. The city engineer became a powerful figure. The laying of sewer pipes and water mains was documented in plat books that mapped the subterranean infrastructure. The Paving Commission issued contracts for granite blocks and asphalt. The sanitary inspector patrolled the tenements, issuing citations for violations of the health code. These citations were tracked in a docket of violations. The building department required the filing of architectural plans for every new structure. The permit became the license to build, to dig, or to operate a business. The technology of the office continued to evolve with the mimeograph and the hectograph. These devices allowed for the duplication of circulars and memos in the office itself, bypassing the printer. The mimeograph used a waxed stencil cut by the typewriter ribbon or a stylus. Ink was forced through the stencil by a roller, creating a copy on porous paper. The smell of the duplicating fluid and the ink was pungent. This technology allowed for the rapid dissemination of office orders and bulletins, tightening the internal communication loop of the bureaus. The vertical file began to replace the pigeonhole and the flat box. The realization that papers could be stored on their edge, in folders, revolutionized information retrieval. The file clerk could now browse a drawer of files without lifting the weight of the stack. The tab on the file folder allowed for indexing by name or number. This system required a standardized size of paper, pushing the government toward the adoption of the letter size, sheet, 8 by 10.5 inches or similar, as the norm, moving away from the variable sizes of the earlier era. The telephone began to appear in the offices of cabinet secretaries and bureau chiefs, though it was not yet on every desk. The switchboard was installed in the larger buildings, operated by operators who physically connected the circuits with patch cords. The telephone directory was a thin booklet. The use of the phone was initially reserved for urgent, ephemeral business, as it left no paper record. However, the Memorandum of Conversation, or Memkin, was soon invented to capture the substance of these voice transactions for the file. The Post Office Department introduced the Special Delivery Service, a premium product that guaranteed immediate delivery by a special messenger upon arrival at the post office. The blue stamp used for this service was a visual indicator of urgency. The railway mail service reached its peak of efficiency. The fast mail trains were dedicated entirely to the post, running at high speeds with the right of way over passenger traffic. The mail catcher arm on the side of the car snatched pouches from cranes at 60 miles an hour. The scheme of distribution used by the clerks was a mental map of thousands of post offices and their rail connections, a feat of memorization tested by card exams, where the clerk had to sort deck after deck of address cards without error. The Civil War pension system continued to expand, becoming a de facto system of social security for the Northern population. The Arrears Act had opened the floodgates for retroactive claims. The pension attorney, or claim agent, became a ubiquitous figure in Washington, filing paperwork on behalf of veterans for a fee. The pension building featured a massive central court designed to circulate air and accommodate the inaugural balls, but its galleries were lined with clerks working on the pending files. The card index of the Pension Bureau was one of the largest in the world, a cross-reference database of names, regiments, and certificate numbers. The Department of Agriculture attained cabinet status, reflecting the political power of the agrarian sector. Its bureaus became scientific institutes. The Bureau of Animal Industry was tasked with the inspection of meat for export. The microscope became an administrative tool. Inspectors examined samples of pork for trichinosis. The Certificate of Inspection was attached to the carcass, a document that allowed American meat to enter foreign markets. The experiment stations, established in the states, were linked to the department, creating a federal network of agricultural research. The Geological Survey was mapping the mineral wealth of the continent. The topographic quadrangle map was the standard output. These maps, with their brown contour lines, blue water features, and black cultural features, imposed a uniform visual language on the diverse geography of the nation. The field notebook of the geologist was a primary record, containing sketches of rock formations and strata. These notes were translated into folios and monographs, heavy volumes filled with lithographed plates of fossils and cross-sections. The Bureau of Labor was established to collect statistics on the condition of the workforce. It did not regulate, but it measured. The strike report was a new form of data. Agents collected information on the number of strikes, the hours of labor, and the wages in various industries. The cost of living survey began to track the price of bread, coal, and rent. This labor statistics data was published in bulletins, providing the numerical basis for the emerging debates on industrial relations. As the decade drew to a close, the physical frontier was declared closed by the superintendent of the census, based on the density of settlement. The administrative frontier, however, was thickening. The administrative state was becoming a reality, a layer of permanent professional management that sat above the political fray. The grid of the township, the zone of the time belt, the rate of the railroad, and the grade of the civil service exam were the invisible lines that now held the nation together. The office buildings in Washington were growing taller, their basements filled with the furnace-dried air of central heating, and their attics filled with the ever-accumulating strata of yellowing paper. As the 19th century drew to its close and the 20th began to dawn, the administrative pulse of the nation quickened, driven by a new philosophy of scientific management and the electrification of the office. The era of the handwritten ledger was not ending, but it was being enveloped by a mechanical superstructure. The government was no longer merely a recorder of deeds and a collector of duties. It was becoming a laboratory of statistics and a regulator of standards. The Bureau evolved from a room of desks into a complex system of information processing, where the individual clerk was a single cog in a vast, integrated machine. The census of 1890 had marked the pivotal moment of this transformation with the introduction of the electric tabulating machine. The sheer volume of the population had outstripped the capacity of the human tally mark. The solution was the punch card, a piece of stiff manila paper stock, roughly 3 by 7 inches, printed with a grid of numbers. The data of a human life, age, race, nativity, occupation, was translated into a pattern of holes. The punch clerk operated a device that looked like a pantograph. The movement of a stylus over a template caused a punch to descend, perforating the card. The counting of these cards was no longer visual but electromechanical. The card was placed into the press of the tabulator. A handle was pulled down, bringing a set of spring-loaded pins against the card. Where there was a hole, the pin passed through into a cup of mercury, completing an electrical circuit. This circuit triggered a magnet that advanced a dial on the face of the machine. The sound of the census office was a constant, rhythmic clatter of metal pins and the ringing of bells that signaled a completed card. The sorting box, connected to the tabulator, would automatically open the lid of the correct compartment for filing the card. This was the industrialization of demographics. The population was now a deck of cards, sortable, countable, and analyzable at a speed previously unimaginable. In the Department of Agriculture, the scope of administration expanded into the molecular composition of food. The passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act required the creation of a massive chemical bureaucracy. The Bureau of Chemistry became a hive of laboratories. The food inspector collected samples from markets and slaughterhouses, cans of peas, bottles of ketchup, cuts of meat. These samples were tagged with official seals and transported to the lab. The analyst worked at a bench lined with burettes and reagents. The detection of adulterants, formaldehyde in milk, borax in meat, copper sulfate in canned vegetables, was a chemical process recorded in laboratory notebooks. The microscopist examined samples for biological contaminants. The results were entered onto analysis sheets. If a violation was found, a notice of hearing was issued to the manufacturer. The seizure of goods was a legal logistical act. The United States Marshal, acting on the chemist's report, would attach a label to the physical crates, placing them under the custody of the court. The food label itself became a regulated document. The font size, the placement of the net weight, and the listing of ingredients were scrutinized for compliance with the regulations. The management of the public lands shifted from disposal to conservation with the rise of the Forest Service. The Forest Reserve was a new administrative unit, distinct from the public domain. The Forest Ranger was the field agent of this system. His station was often a remote cabin connected to the world only by a single telephone wire strung through the trees. The Ranger's Bible was the use book, a pocket-sized manual of regulations that governed grazing, timber cutting, and fire patrol. The grazing permit was the central instrument of control. Stockmen had to apply for the right to run cattle or sheep on the reserve. The ranger had to count the stock, checking the brands against the application. The drift fence was a physical manifestation of this administration, guiding the movement of herds. The timber sale involved the marking of individual trees for cutting. The ranger used a marking axe with a raised U.S. die on the pole to blaze the tree. The scale book recorded the volume of the logs in board feet. The fire report was a detailed post-mortem of any conflagration, mapping the burn area and calculating the value of the timber destroyed. The Post Office Department revolutionized rural life with the implementation of Rural Free Delivery, RFD. The rural carrier was a contractor who provided his own wagon and horse. The wagon, often a mail wagon with sliding doors and a sorting rack inside, was a mobile post office. The mailbox became a standardized object. Farmers were required to erect boxes that met specific government specifications regarding height and accessibility. The flag on the box was a signal system. Up meant mail to be collected, down meant the box was empty. The route of the rural carrier was a measured path. The road odometer attached to the wagon wheel measured the precise mileage for compensation. The patron list was the roster of families on the route. The carrier sold stamps, registered letters, and issued money orders from his wagon. This service integrated the isolated farm into the national economy of catalogs and newspapers. The mail order catalog, a massive volume of consumption, relied entirely on this administrative chain. The processing of money orders became a banking function of the post office, involving the issuance of a paper draft and the retention of an advice slip for the auditor. The physical storage of information underwent a revolution with the widespread adoption of the vertical filing cabinet. The flat file, where papers were stacked in bundles, was abandoned for the file folder standing on edge. The oak cabinet with 4 drawers became the totem of the office. The tab system allowed for the indexing of files by name, subject, or number. The guide card, made of heavy pressboard, separated the sections. This verticality allowed for the central files concept, where all correspondence was consolidated in a single room rather than scattered in individual desks. The file clerk was the custodian of this memory. The out card was a placeholder inserted when a file was removed, recording who had it and when. The cross-reference sheet was a navigational aid, directing the searcher to related files. The tickler file was a chronological system, a set of folders numbered 1 to 31 for the days of the month, used to bring matters up for attention on a specific date. The office was becoming a machine for remembering. The typewriter had conquered the desk. The machine was now a standardized industrial object with a QWERTY keyboard and a visible platen. The stenographer or typist was a specialized professional. The dictation was taken in shorthand notebooks and then transcribed. The carbon copy was ubiquitous, creating an instant duplicate for the file. The purple ink of the hectograph gave way to the sharp black of the carbon ribbon. The letter press was replaced by the filing carbon. Form letters were produced in mass by the multigraph, a rotary printing machine for the office. The Civil Service Commission refined the efficiency record. The work of the clerk was timed and graded. The time clock at the entrance of the department punched the arrival and departure time on a card. Tardiness was deducted from leave. The production record counted the number of letters typed, warrants drawn, or cards punched. This data was used to determine promotions and salary increases. The personnel folder grew to include not just the application and the exam score, but a continuous history of the employee's performance. The Government Printing Office, GPO, operated as the factory of the state's language. The monotype and linotype machines replaced hand setting. The operator sat at a keyboard, casting lines of lead type from molten metal. The galley proof was a long strip of paper used for correction. The Congressional Record was produced daily, a transcript of the legislative branch delivered to the desk of every member each morning. The public documents were cataloged by the Superintendent of Documents, who issued a monthly catalog of all government publications. The depository library system ensured that these documents were distributed to libraries across the country, creating a decentralized archive of the state. The Library of Congress began to organize the nation's books through the printed card service. The catalog card, a standard 3 by 5 inch card, contained the bibliographic data of a book. The library printed these cards and sold them to other libraries, standardizing the classification of knowledge. The classification schedule, a system of letters and numbers, assigned a unique address to every subject. The Copyright Office within the library managed the registration of intellectual property. The deposit copy of every copyrighted book, map, and piece of music was filed in the stacks. The Department of Commerce and Labor was created to oversee the industrial economy. The Bureau of Corporations had the power to investigate the conduct of businesses. The subpoena duces tecum required companies to produce their ledgers and correspondence for inspection. The special examiner traveled to corporate headquarters to audit the books. The Steamboat Inspection Service mandated the testing of boilers and the licensing of hulls. The boilerplate was drilled and measured. The life preserver was inspected for the quality of the cork. The Immigration Service at Ellis Island and Angel Island operated a high-volume processing center. The boarding officer went out to the ships in the harbor. The manifest sheet was the control document. On the island, the registry clerk sat at a high desk, questioning the immigrant against the manifest. The detention card was issued to those held for special inquiry. The dining hall for detainees was a logistical operation, serving thousands of meals a day according to dietary lists. The deportation warrant was the legal instrument for removal, requiring the steamship company to take the individual back at its own expense. The War Department modernized its administration with the general staff system. The Army War College became a center for planning. The war game and the staff ride were administrative simulations. The mobilization plan was a theoretical document, a set of tables and schedules for the movement of troops in a hypothetical conflict. The Personnel Bureau adopted the identification tag, the dog tag, as a mandatory item for soldiers, a stamped metal disc ensuring that the body could always be administratively identified. The Navy Department managed a global fleet of coal-burning steel battleships. The coaling station was a strategic node. The collier, a coal supply ship, was dispatched according to a coaling schedule. The consumption of coal was tracked in engineering logs. The gunnery log recorded the performance of the new long-range guns. The fire control system on the ship was an analog computer of gears and dials, calculating the trajectory. The wireless telegraph installed on the ships allowed for communication over the horizon. The radiogram was a new form of naval correspondence, written on a pad and handed to the wireless operator in the shack. The Panama Canal project was the ultimate administrative undertaking of the era. It was governed by the Isthmian Canal Commission. The property accounting for the project involved the tracking of steam shovels, locomotives, and tons of dynamite. The sanitary department managed the mosquito. The larvicide was sprayed on standing water. The hospital record tracked the cases of yellow fever and malaria. The payroll of the canal zone was a massive operation, paying thousands of workers in gold and silver. The service record of the canal worker determined his eligibility for housing and commissary privileges. The Treasury Department established the Division of Bookkeeping and Warrants to centralize the accounts. The adding machine, the Burroughs calculator, became a fixture. The crank of the machine was pulled to register the figures. The tape produced by the machine was a physical audit trail. The check signing machine allowed a signature to be pantographed onto multiple checks simultaneously. The controller of the currency supervised the national banks through call reports. demanding a statement of condition at irregular intervals. As the decade progressed, the visual language of the government became one of uniformity. The form number printed in the corner of every document, e.g., Form 1040, identified its place in the system. The style manual of the GPO dictated the spelling and capitalization of every official word. The routing slip, attached to documents, directed their path through the hierarchy. The in-basket and out-basket defined the flow of work. The office was a silent, well-lit space of oak furniture, linoleum floors, and the smell of ozone from the electric fans. The chaotic, hand-written republic had been fully encased in a structure of typed, filed, and indexed order. The system was now self-perpetuating, a vast, inanimate memory that operated by its own internal logic, waiting for the 20th century to fill its vertical files with the paperwork of empire. In the second decade of the 20th century, the administrative state achieved a new level of granularity with the ratification of the 16th Amendment. The taxation of personal income transformed the relationship between the citizen and the government into a matter of annual reporting. The Form 1040 emerged as the primary instrument of this relationship. It was a document of 4 pages, accompanied by a set of instructions that attempted to define net income through a series of deductions and exemptions. The filing of this return was a ritual of compliance, requiring the taxpayer to translate their labor and assets into a single column of figures. The processing of these returns took place in the income tax unit of the Bureau of Internal Revenue. The volume of paper was immediate and overwhelming. Large rooms were cleared to accommodate the sorting section. Returns were categorized by the size of the income. Incomes under $3,000, incomes over $3,000, and corporate returns. The auditor sat at a desk piled high with these forms, equipped with a red ink pen for corrections. The arithmetic error was the most common administrative fault. The auditor's task was to verify the calculation of the normal tax and the surtax. If a discrepancy was found, a deficiency letter was typed and mailed, initiating a cycle of correspondence that could last for months. To manage the financial circulatory system of the nation, the Federal Reserve System was established, creating a centralized architecture for banking. The Gold Settlement Fund in Washington became the pivot point of this system. This was a ledger-based reality where ownership of gold shifted between the 12 Federal Reserve banks without the metal ever leaving the vault. Each evening, telegraphic reports of the day's clearings were sent to Washington. A clerk in the board's office would tally the credits and debits due to each bank. The settlement was a simple entry in the books, transferring millions of dollars in gold ownership from the account of the New York Bank to the Chicago Bank, or from San Francisco to Richmond. This wire transfer of value was an abstraction that stabilized the physical economy. The concept of standardization was institutionalized in the National Bureau of Standards, located on a hill outside the city to avoid the vibrations of streetcars. This agency was the keeper of the physical constants. The standard kilogram and the standard meter, bars of platinum iridium, were kept in a vault, protected by double doors. They were the ultimate reference points for all commerce. The comparator was a massive instrument used to calibrate the working standards sent in by state governments and industries. The Bureau's work extended to the testing of materials for government purchase. The cement laboratory tested samples for the construction of federal buildings and dams. Briquettes of cement were subjected to crushing machines to measure tensile strength. The paper laboratory tested the durability of the paper used for currency and ledgers, measuring its folding endurance and resistance to tearing. The clinical thermometer testing station handled thousands of instruments, placing them in water baths of precise temperature to verify their accuracy. Each passing thermometer received a certificate. Those that failed were destroyed. The administration of quality had become a matter of physics and chemistry. The entry of the nation into the Great War in 1917 triggered the ultimate test of this administrative machine. The Selective Service System was created to manage the conscription of manpower on a scale never before attempted. The registration day was a synchronized administrative event. On a single day, millions of men presented themselves at precinct polling places to complete their registration cards. These cards, blue for those who had registered late, green for the initial wave, recorded the essential data: name, age, address, citizenship, and occupation. The order number was assigned through a central lottery in Washington. Capsules containing numbers were drawn from a glass bowl, and the sequence was telegraphed to every local draft board. The classification of registrants was the work of the local boards. Men were sorted into 5 classes based on dependency and occupation. The questionnaire was a 16-page document mailed to every registrant. The answers determined whether a man was Class I, available for service, or Class V, exempt. The file of the registrant became a dossier of his life, containing affidavits from employers, doctors, and relatives. The induction notice was the final output, a command to report to a rail station at a specific hour. To ensure this mobilized force, the Bureau of War Risk Insurance was established, instantly becoming one of the largest insurance concerns in the world. The Bureau occupied a temporary structure, the Arlington Building, which was a labyrinth of filing cabinets. The premium card was the control document. Soldiers had the premiums deducted from their pay. The beneficiary file recorded the names of wives and mothers. The volume of typing was so great that the night shift became a permanent feature. The sound of the Bureau was a continuous roar of typewriters and the clack of addressograph machines. The addressograph used embossed metal plates to rapidly stamp names and addresses onto checks and notices, a mechanization of the copyist's trade. The War Industries Board attempted to administer the industrial economy through the priority system. Manufacturers were issued priority certificates that dictated the order in which their orders for steel, copper, or coal would be filled. A Class A priority took precedence over a Class B. The commodity section chiefs sat in offices, tracking the national stocks of wool, nitrate, and leather. The Conservation Division issued regulations to reduce waste. The size of sample swatches was reduced, the number of colors of typewriter ribbons was limited, and the styles of shoes were standardized. These regulations were disseminated through circulars to the trade associations. The Division of Investigation, the precursor to the FBI, began to systematize the identification of criminals and subversives. The fingerprint file was consolidated in Washington. The Henry classification system allowed for the filing of fingerprints based on the pattern of loops, whorls, and arches. A clerk could retrieve a specific card from thousands by following the alphanumeric formula derived from the ridges. The identification card, 8 by 8 inches, became the standard format. The slacker raids produced thousands of detainees whose identities had to be verified against the draft registration lists. The Index of Radicals was a card catalog of names and organizations suspected of sedition, cross-reference to case files containing reports from field agents. The Committee on Public Information administered the flow of news. The official bulletin was a daily government newspaper, printed and distributed to post offices and military camps. It contained the texts of proclamations, the casualty lists, and the orders of the various boards. The censor sat in the cable offices and the post offices, reviewing the communications crossing the Atlantic. The postal censorship involved the opening of mail to and from foreign countries. The examiner read the letters, excised sensitive information with a razor or black ink, and resealed the envelope with a "opened by censor" label. The condemned mail was filed in the archives of the censorship board. The logistical movement of the American Expeditionary Force required a service of supply that mirrored the domestic administration. The port of embarkation was a funnel for men and material. The passenger list of the troop transport was a manifest of thousands of souls. The dog tag, now 2 aluminum discs worn around the neck, was the final administrative link to the individual. One tag remained with the body, the other was collected for the record. The burial file in the grave's registration service was precise. It recorded the map coordinates of the grave, the cause of death, and the inventory of personal effects found on the body. These effects were packaged and returned to the family, a grim final transaction. In the post-war period, the Veterans Bureau was created to consolidate the medical and insurance responsibilities. The hospitalization of veterans required a massive expansion of federal facilities. The claim number became the veteran's identity within the system. The rating board determined the percentage of disability. The vocational rehabilitation program involved the tracking of students and trainees, requiring monthly reports of attendance and progress. The Budget and Accounting Act of 1921 established the Bureau of the Budget, finally imposing a central executive control over the estimates of the departments. The budget call was an annual instruction to all agencies to submit their funding requests. These requests were compiled into the President's Budget, a book of immense thickness that detailed the proposed expenditure for every pencil, clerk, and battleship. The General Accounting Office was established as the independent auditor, checking the vouchers of the executive branch against the appropriations. The Comptroller General issued decisions on the legality of payments, creating a body of administrative law that governed the spending of public funds. The passport became a mandatory document for international travel, no longer a luxury for the few. The Passport Division of the State Department required proof of citizenship, a birth certificate or naturalization papers, and a photograph. The photograph had to be glued to the application and embossed with the seal. The visa system required the consular officers abroad to vet travelers before they boarded the ship. The quota system for immigration imposed a strict numerical limit on the number of entrants from each country. The consular invoice remained the key document for trade, but the visa number became the key for the movement of people. The physical office had now fully transitioned to the steel age. Wooden filing cabinets were replaced by fireproof steel vertical files. The suspension folder hung on rails, allowing for easier access. The pneumatic tube systems in the larger buildings hissed with the movement of carriers. The dictaphone allowed the executive to record his letters on a wax cylinder, which was then shaved and reused. The mimeograph room was a production center for the endless stream of office memoranda. The interoffice mail envelope, with its grid of names and holes to check for contents, circulated endlessly through the corridors. The National Archives was conceptually formed to solve the crisis of record storage, though the building was yet to rise. The Records Survey attempted to locate the valuable papers of the founding era amidst the accumulated detritus of the 19th century. Old custom house records were found in damp cellars. Census schedules were stored in non-fireproof attics. The preservation of the state paper became a professional concern. The lamination process was developed to seal fragile documents in cellulose acetate. As the lights of the great department buildings burned into the night, the cleaning crews moved through the silent rows of desks. They swept the floors around the legs of the typewriters and emptied the waste baskets filled with carbon paper and drafts. The watchmen punched their keys into the station clocks, recording their rounds. The vaults of the treasury were sealed, the time lock set. The holorith machine stood covered in the Census Bureau. The addressograph plates were racked in their steel drawers. The administration had become a permanent, self-regulating entity, a vast structure of files, indices, and ledgers that mirrored the nation in every detail. From the birth certificate to the death certificate, from the land patent to the tax return, the life of the citizen was captured in the continuous, quiet accretion of ink on paper. The wilderness had been surveyed, the population counted, the revenue assessed, and the laws codified. The machinery of the state, built upon 10,000 regulations and stored in 1,000,000 steel drawers, waited in the dark for the clerks to return at 8 in the morning, ready to begin the next day of the eternal process.